Hello, and welcome to Faith at the Frontiers, a podcast that confronts challenges to the Christian faith with hope. In this episode, we talk with Karen Swallow Prior, an expert in Victorian literature and well-known writer and speaker. She's the author of The Evangelical Imagination: How Stories, Images, and Metaphors Created a Culture in Crisis. In this episode, we talk with her about some of the influences that have shaped the social imaginary of evangelicals, and how that might help us understand exvangelicalism. If you enjoy this episode, be sure to like and subscribe. Well, thank you so much for being with us here today, Karen, to continue our series talking about exvangelicalism. You have written a book called The Evangelical Imagination, and I just wanted to start by asking you a little bit about that. Thinking about the role of imagination in shaping evangelicalism. Can you tell us a bit about what that looks like and why you think it's an important topic right now?
Yeah, no, that's thank you for asking. The title of the book is a little bit of a trap because what I'm really talking about in the book is the social imaginary of evangelicalism, drawing heavily on Charles Taylor. But of course, that term and that concept, which I explain in the book and will briefly here, is directly connected to the imagination. Mm-hmm. And as someone who loves literature and art and studies them and enjoys them, of course, the imagination is important to me. And so I do spend some time in the book talking about sort of the imagination, what it means, and I think most importantly, just thinking about how it means, it's literally talking about our being made in the image of God. Like, we are the product of God's imagination. He imaged us. We are made in his image, and the implications for that are so profound and provocative. I could talk about that all day. But the connection that I make between that kind of thing that we mean the imagination and the works of the imagination, and what I'm really talking about in the book as the social imaginary, is sort of our collective imaginations, like this, as the subtitle suggests, the stories, images, and metaphors, and Charles Taylor adds like the legends and myths that are handed down to us, that are just sort of part of our community, and they always exist in the plural, right? Because we're part of different communities, and so just simply existing in a community means that we inherit stories and images and expectations and visions that we might not even be thinking about. They're just sort of expectations. Taylor actually says that they're precognitive, so we're not thinking about them until we're confronted with them. And so every community has a social imaginary or social imaginaries, and we might not think about the ingredients of them until we do so on purpose or something forces us to do that. And so what I do in the book, and what I've been doing really for the past few decades of my life as an evangelical, is thinking about the history of evangelicalism, which I know you're covering on this podcast, but not just from the perspective of history or sociology or politics, but our imaginative works, the literature, the songs, the stories that are part of that 300-year tradition. And they aren't limited to just those things produced by evangelicals. One of my favorite ones that I draw on all the time and do in the book is Charles Dickens. He was not an evangelical. He wasn't even really an Orthodox Christian. He was a Christian of some kind, but his stories and the way that he interacted with the evangelicalism of the time was mutually influential. Like, he tells stories of conversion. He tells stories of Christmas, a Christmas carol, and having a dramatic conversion, and what that means. And these are the kinds of things that influence, I don't mean it in a negative way, the way that evangelicals think about the things that are important to us.
Could I ask for one or two examples of one of these things that is in the evangelical social imaginary that we don't tend to think about?
So if you are an evangelical and you kind of grew up utterly enclosed within evangelicalism, you probably have one understanding of what it means to be born again or saved, or whatever metaphor you might use for it.
Have a personal relationship with Jesus.
Have a personal relationship with Jesus. And that would involve some sort of conscious, aware moment of which you can name the date and the time and the hour at which you believed, right? And that's when you became born again or a Christian or whatever. And so if you were raised entirely in that environment, and many of us were, and you encounter someone from a different Christian tradition who uses different language and maybe doesn't remember the day, the time, the hour, you might question whether that person could possibly be a Christian. And as you wrestle through it, you might realize, oh, you just have different ways of talking about this experience, of thinking about it. And if you didn't even know you're supposed to remember the day, the time, and the hour, then you might not actually, because no one told you you were supposed to mark that in your prayer journal. And so, or you could discover someone, on the contrary, who can name all those things, but you get to know that person after a while and you think, did they really have that experience? And so this is an example of kind of a set of expectations, some language that we use, some metaphors that are particular to evangelicalism, the
That's
testimony, the conversion.
It does resonate with my experience, because I remember just being in a random class at a secular institution and having a chat with a guy just outside the class, and he found out I was a Christian. The first thing he asked me was, "Are you born again?" And I realized what he wanted to know was, am I the same kind of Christian as him? It was almost like a shibboleth, are you my kind of Christian?
No, that's exactly, it translates to that, or sometimes it can be even worse, that you can't be a Christian if you don't use that language or imagery. And yeah, I come from more of those kind of people. So yeah.
Without getting too far afield, I wonder, this is one of the things actually I wanted to ask you about, was thinking about exvangelicalism, which we'll shift to a bit. One of the things that strikes me about it is that there's maybe a lot of people leaving exvangelicalism have a similar sense of like a conversion experience out of it. And I wonder if you see any of that as a sort of like, because this really common sense of conversion, is that also shaping what it means for people when they sort of are no longer evangelical?
I really do think that, of course, that's not always the case, but I think that is a big part of the experience. Like if you were an evangelical and you have this social imaginary about conversion, then leaving it often involves using kind of the same social imaginary and having a similar kind of conversion experience. Now, again, it could be gradual or it could be sudden. And another element, and this is sort of so common, it's become a cliche, is the idea that, that someone who was a fundamentalist as a Christian or evangelical, often they become fundamentalists, on the other side, on the progressive or the liberal or unbelieving side. Again, it really has to do more with posture and form than content, unless we make a conscious, deliberate decision or go through a process to think about inheriting or adopting a different social imaginary and posture.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And even one of the things about kind of evangelical conversionism is that it's usually really individualistic, right?
Yes.
Every individual has this kind of experience in these things, which I think is also really common, kind of evangelical thing of, we often growing up in those spaces, you don't learn, say, communal ways of discerning these things or going through these things or, these other kinds of aspects. Yeah, so I think it's really interesting. That's one of the things that struck me about your book, was how many of these kind of deep elements of our social imaginary still hold, even for people who no longer identify as evangelical, that this is this sort of underlying thing that I often come across and think, wow, you guys are still think and speak in these ways.
No, I think that's absolutely true.
So thinking about our cultural moment then, I think obviously the sort of everything that's going on in the U.S. Made you think maybe we should write a book to help everyone understand how these images have sort of shaped us, but also maybe because now we're facing them in new ways, or they're starting to be new things. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, there were. I was drawing on kind of a long set of experiences teaching, in particular, Victorian literature to evangelical students, because even though the evangelical movement proper began the century before, it's really in the height of the Victorian period where it reaches its greatest cultural and artistic and political influence in both England and America. I think, well, now we have a different kind of influence in 21st century America. So there was that sort of long history, watching my evangelical students kind of struggle with, hey, what's the difference between what's Christian and what's just Victorian? But that sort of thought that was in the back of my mind for a long time reached new urgency, in the past few years, as even the term evangelical has been making headlines and becoming such a big part of the political climate, that I just thought that this idea that I had for a while could have sort of a more pressing application to the current moment. Everyone's writing about evangelicals and ex-evangelicals, and I just thought this could be a little bit different way of thinking about it through the social imaginary.
Yeah, and it is. I think it's a really helpful, different approach, right? Because you kind of have like sociological or political descriptions of evangelicals or theological descriptions, and everyone kind of debates what those things are. And I find this a really helpful way of saying, like, in some sense, evangelicals kind of share this broader social imaginary. I mean, particularly American evangelicals, and there'd be some differences there. But I think it's quite a fascinating way in thinking about this. And I realized also, reading your book, that for me, I think the people who have most helped me understand evangelicalism and the history of it have been experts in Victorian either history or literature. So there is something about sort of grasping that period of time and seeing the kind of culture in which all of this kind of coalesced, that I think is really, really helpful, as people like Don Lewis.
It's shortly after the rise. It's when evangelicalism rose to prominence, isn't it? And started to become an actual political and cultural force, at least for a while, even in the UK. It's not really a political force in the UK anymore, but it was back then, wasn't it?
It really was, and it's the later Victorian, the children of the Victorians, or the evangelical Victorians, often, who are criticizing, really skewering their parents' faith in a way that's not, that I don't necessarily accept that they do offer helpful criticism. I think especially of Thomas Hardy. All of his novels are about the failure of evangelical faith to do something or other. And so reading those novels and struggling through those kinds of questions myself and with students, kind of looking at the evangelicalism's influence on the reverse side, is actually helpful, I think, and helps us to ask some better questions.
So that's interesting, because it shows that sort of public criticism of evangelicalism is no new thing. It's not something that just started in the last 8 years. Yeah.
I think that's really helpful and important for people to know. I, as an evangelical, I do. This isn't new. But it also doesn't mean it's not important. It just means that this has been an ongoing thing. I mean, Jane Austen disdained the evangelicals. So this has been going on a long time.
And also the kind of different generations of evangelicals, right? You have the kind of Hanoverian evangelicals, and then their children kind of react against a lot of that. And so it is also this sense of, generations sort of embody their evangelical faith sometimes in really opposed ways. Maybe something of what we're seeing in kind of exvangelicalism is that kind of thing going on. But I do think it's helpful to see that going all the way back to, some of these roots. What about, can you give us there's so many, I think, really interesting images that the different chapters kind of follow. Do you want to give us a couple more of those that you think have sort of shaped the evangelical social imaginary?
Yeah, I start with conversion, because that's just so, I think that is one of the key elements of the Bebington Quadrilateral, which I'm sure you've discussed here, is conversionism. That's a central component. And then another one that goes right along with it that I talk about is testimony. How, like, if you've had a conversion, you have to have a testimony to share about it. Which, of course, as a person who loves literature and stories and narrative, of course, I love testimonies too. But there's a way in which evangelicalism talks about testimony. It has to be a certain kind and follow a sort of certain trajectory.
It has a certain function, right? It has a certain spiritual function.
Yes, it does, and it's supposed to look a certain way too. There's supposed to be like a certain dramatic before and after, which is wonderful. It's wonderful to have a dramatic testimony. Paul has one, right? A very dramatic testimony. But, we're not all Paul. And the sort of drawback of that is to think that, if we don't have that dramatic testimony, then our testimony is lesser. Or even in a more sinister iteration of this idea, people can, and I've seen this myself, unfortunately, sort of pad the story, right? Embellish the before, make it worse than it was, or, or feel more pressure for the after to be very, very dramatic, and there can't be any back and forth. There can't be any growth. It has to be completely linear. So again, testimony is a wonderful thing. But we have to understand its limitations and also understand how it functions. It has come to function, whether that's right or wrong, good or bad, and that it's not a template, right? It's not something. It's not a formula.
It's not a sort of one size fits all thing. Like
exactly.
Not every Christian has to have this dramatic moment, this decisive moment. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And teaching young evangelicals, you come across this a lot. The ones who sort of just grew up in a wonderful family, and they're like, I don't know, I've been a Christian as long as I can remember, and then they feel like they're not good Christians because they needed to at least, drink a bunch in high school or something.
Well, but you're right. It has to do with the way you interpret your own past as well. You can choose to highlight the bits of your own past that are worse and more negative. Oh, I didn't really have a relationship with Jesus because I didn't this or that. And I think that all goes all the way back to John Wesley, doesn't it? I remember reading a biography of John Wesley, and I found out that, that critical moment when he says he felt his heart was strangely warmed. And it seems, he says shortly after that he sort of wasn't really a Christian before that moment. Whereas if I'd been reading up until that moment, and I was like, you were already a pastor, like you
right.
The things you did and said, you were definitely already a Christian. Like...
No, that's a great example, because it's very confusing reading his story when you come to it with this set of expectations, and you're like, wait a minute, he was already a pastor. There are so many like that. And again, someone could be a pastor and really not be converted, but there is this sort of was it called in music, backtracking, or I don't know what the musical term is, but
just a reinterpret. I don't know.
Reinterpretation.
But you can change the way you look at the past based on things that have happened to you later, and you see it in a different light. Yeah.
Yeah, and this strikes me as it's quite profound. It makes me think of I don't know if you've read Julian Barnes's novel, The Sense of an Ending.
Yeah, I just read it. I did like a month ago. Yeah.
So he kind of has a story of his life, and then he comes across all these things that contradict that story, and has to rethink kind of who he's been. But that book, I remember reading it a long time ago, but it really struck me at the time because I was personally in the midst of this realization that I had always had one way of telling my life story, I think largely influenced by this sense of kind of needing a testimony. And I kind of felt like that actually, it wasn't the most truthful life story. And you sort of, as a young adult, I think maybe I'm weird, but I feel like a lot of people go through this sense of like, how do I tell the story of who I've been and who I am? And that novel was really helpful for me to think about how profound that is. But I think that this image is so interesting for so many evangelicals. There was like a template, there's a set template for how you narrate the story of your life, and therefore how you sort of remember and understand your own identity. And I think that probably has some pretty profound and wide-ranging influence, maybe for good and bad, right? But I think it's really, really striking.
Are there any other examples of elements of the evangelical imaginary?
Well, I mean, another one that I talk about in the book, I talk about, let's see, it's hard to pick them all, but I talk about, let's see, which you should tell me which one to talk about. But no, this isn't so much an image, it's more, again, a posture or way of being, but it's sentimentalism. Mm-hmm. I find the history of sentimentalism really interesting, especially as it relates to evangelicals, because we do have, I find it really to be the reason why we have so much bad art. And it goes back, I think actually even Wesley's, talking about how his heart was strangely warmed. There was a right and good response to sort of the cold rationalism of, the years immediately following the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. I mean, the Romantics later reacted to this. So there's this sort of ping-ponging back and forth throughout human history, and including church history, of rationalism and emotionalism, and evangelicalisms fall in that camp that tends to emphasize sentimentality and emotion more than some other counterparts. And again, the trick is always, as a human and as a Christian, to get things in proper balance. But because evangelicalism emerged in this moment of of kind of clinging to sort of the heart and the emotional aspect of the religious faith, it has continued to influence us. And so that's why, again, even in the Victorian age, we see a rise in sort of sentimental art and sentimental stories. Even Dickens, whom I love, errs towards sentimentality. And even today, we can look at a lot of the music, the worship music, and the art produced by evangelicals tends to be very sentimental. And as a fan of Flannery O'Connor, who was actually Catholic, I mean, she skewers sentimentality by comparing it basically to obscenity or pornography, because it's emotion apart from its purpose is parallel to sex apart from its purpose. Those are some harsh words, but those are ones
that's a severe criticism.
It's a very severe criticism.
Do you think there's any trace of influence from the German Romantic movement into evangelicalism? I ask because I'm not an expert on the Romantic movement, but I do get the sense that it was a cause of the Romantic movement that the notion of the heart and the notion of love even changed from being about the will to being more about the emotions and more about feeling. And do you see some traces of influence there from the Romantic movement into the evangelical community?
I can speak more to the English Romantics and the German Romantics, but of course those are also pretty directly related. I absolutely do think so. I mean, even though the Romantics are not ones that we would, link with evangelicals, they were both sort of responding to the rationalism of the 18th century. And again, it's good to counter an excess with correction, but if we overcorrect, then we've just committed the sort of the same error. And I think that evangelicalism for most of its existence has been more in the era of over sentimentality.
Virtue is a balance between two wrong extremes, right? So
exactly.
Yeah, very interesting.
And virtue is hard.
Could I just press for a more detailed definition of what sentimentality actually is, which has to do with the emotions, but
right. So more? I mean, at its basis, I would just say sentimentality is emotional, sort of in the most basic definition. But sentimentalism, I think is anytime you put ism after a word, then you're talking about maybe an excess. And so
I see.
So if we just are talking about something that is sentimental or sentimentality, we're talking about its emotional worth or value. If we have an object that we might say it has sentimental value, we'll say, oh, it doesn't have monetary value. It just has an emotional attachment for me. And that there's nothing really wrong with that unless it becomes excessive. We're going back to virtue. So sentimentality, if it's recognized as such, can be okay, but if we, for example, have a film or some other story that is spun by evangelicals and it's just playing on our emotions in a way that distorts reality or distorts reason, then it strays into sentimentalism. I don't know if that's helpful.
I'm trying to remember. I feel like Jeremy Begbie has an article on this that I am vaguely remembering, but he talks about it in terms of kind of something that elicits sort of like an emotional catharsis without the the difficulty or challenge that would go with it, right? So like Dickens, to my mind, is a perfect example. I went to a musical version of his Christmas Carol over break, and it just very much struck me that at least that version of it it's all theoretically it's a hardcore critique of kind of capitalism and wealth inequality, but it's done in such a way that sort of like I was surrounded by a bunch of, committed neoliberal capitalists who loved it and had this kind of emotional catharsis, and you feel for Tiny Tim and everybody cries, and you go away and you don't need to feel like you need to worry about wealth inequality or whether or not you might be screwed, right? So it's like that kind of, the sentimentality is the kind of like takes the edge off of things so that it's just about like feeling the emotion of stuff. That's how I think about it, at least, which I feel is fairly common.
Yeah, I think that's actually helpful. I mean, it arose out of an 18th century short-lived movement called the cult of sensibility, which, there's sort of I don't think it really happened. I can't remember where it comes from. It's either like an urban legend of the 18th century or somebody's documented it somewhere, but it's sort of an image. Again, I don't know if it actually happened of the person going into the opera or the production, enjoying the theater, and then coming out and finding that their servant's been waiting by the horse in the rain or the snow for hours, and they feel so much better about themselves because they have felt the passion and the sadness at this production, but then they go out to the real person and feel no compassion at all. That's the sort of stereotype of what the cult of sensibility was. That you are a better person if you feel compassion towards someone else's suffering, but only if you feel it. Like you could walk out of the theater afterwards and not care about your suffering servant, but you're a great person because you cried at the production. That's what you described. Yeah.
I can see this focus on sentimentality in evangelicalism being something that an exvangelical might sort of enthusiastically agree with as a reason not to be evangelical anymore. But for you haven't taken it in that direction. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. Well, I'll give most credit here to Jane Austen because this is what her wonderful novel Sense and Sensibility is all about, right? Sensibility. She uses sensibility in a similar way. Sense is reason, and sensibility is sort of emotion. And we have these two characters, Eleanor and Marianne. Eleanor's all sense and cold rationality, and Marianne's all emotion and romanticism. And without too much of a spoiler alert, the moral of the story ends up being that they both need what the other one has. They need to balance each other out. Neither one is correct. Neither approach to life at the expense of the other is correct, but we all need both. And so, I can look anywhere in history and, again, see a pendulum that swung too far in one direction and then look at a pendulum swung too far in the opposite direction. That's just human nature. That's not evangelicals. That's not Christians. That's all of us. And so wherever we are and wherever we're called to be, obviously there are some lines that end up getting crossed that we have to reject. And that's the question that people are dealing with that you just kind of raised. But we're not going to find the perfect balance anywhere, I don't think.
That's really helpful. So it's just basically not a sufficient reason to consider evangelicalism null and void, basically. Right. But there have been one of the things we are very interested in this podcast is the last 10, 20 years, there's been some dramatic shifts in evangelicalism, especially in the US. I was wondering if you could speak to those from this perspective of the social imaginary and what sorts of new images have arisen or old images have gone away in the last 10, 20 years.
Yeah, I don't want to overly romanticize the past, but when we look at, how, and again, I'm sure you've talked about this on your podcast, but how evangelicalism is defined historically, what its roots were, what its origins, and why its particular emphases were there. I think evangelicalism arose, as needed in that moment, with this emphasis on conversion and activism and Christ's crucifixion and the Bible as authoritative in the life of the believer. Those were things that needed emphasis, and they were emphasized for 300 years, and we are still here. But in recent, it's more than the past 10 years, but we're seeing the fruit, I think, in the past 10 years. There's been such an intermingling of many things, but let's just say American culture, late modern culture, late capitalism, such a mixture in there that those four beautiful things that David Bebbington identified as essential to evangelicalism in the past 300 years have possibly been, outweighed or outpowered by these other things, like institutionalism, for example, would be one that I would first point to. The importance of institutions, evangelical church institutions over some of those other things. And if we just look at that one, then we get a better explanation for why there has been cover-up of sexual abuse or, sexual abuse has always happened and will continue to happen. But the issue isn't that's not the crisis, although it's a crisis in itself, but the crisis is when institutions and the cover up of names and reputations and friendships and networks becomes more important than ending the abuse or dealing with the abuse effectively. To me, I trace that back to an overemphasis on institutions as opposed to individuals. So that's just that's one example of what I see as sort of, but that's not just evangelicals. Again, that's American culture. I mean, we are a culture of institutions, capitalism, consumerism, all of those things, and evangelicalism has become unduly influenced by those components of late modern American capitalism.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I mean, and evangelicalism in America, because of it begins with the kind of the Great Awakening, these kinds of things. So much of its spread happens in that way, that it's a kind of theological populism in some sense, right? And so it's always been deeply intertwined with American culture then in really unique ways. And I think that's the one of the reasons why everyone has a hard time kind of nailing everything down of what's changed in recent years is because it's not new that the kind of American culture is hugely influential for what evangelicalism is. But that obviously things have shifted, right? And certain influences have become much larger and drowned out others, maybe to a much larger degree than they have. But yeah, so I think that's why your analysis is a really helpful way in to think about a social imaginaries, not just to think about like explicitly what do people claim to believe in or think or whatever, but sort of what are they kind of not even thinking about that's shaping how they view the world, and how much of that is coming
how
from...
can you tell what people value by the way they act, I guess?
Yeah.
And that is how much of that's coming from kind of broader secular culture rather than a kind of deep rootedness in an evangelical tradition or whatever. And maybe that's a piece of this is that evangelicalism has never really seen itself as a tradition in a very technical sense. And so it quickly loses the riches of its past. Then. Yeah. So, okay. So let's continue because I have so many questions that I want to ask you. But maybe one of the things, since you brought up institutions, I wonder if you could just speak a little bit to, as someone who's been an educator for a long time in evangelical institutions, what's the connection between maybe sort of how evangelicals have approached education or how they're starting to? You've been critical of a few institutions for sort of the directions they're moving in. Do you see connections between that and these kind of broader social imaginaries of evangelicals?
Yeah, so I mean, I am a huge proponent of Christian education. I love teaching Christian students and teaching them how to think more Christianly and integrate Christian worldview into whatever discipline they might be studying. And so, in theory, I think evangelical institutions schools are wonderful. But again, I don't have any easy answers, but again, I want to look back and point to sort of the American influences, whether that be, for example, the tremendous amounts of money that come in through federal student loans, that becomes the tail that wags it becomes the dog, let alone the tail that's wagging the institution. I've experienced that. Or in the absence, there are some institutions that don't necessarily rely on student loans, but they rely on donors. And we're seeing this not just in evangelical institutions, we're seeing it, the elite Ivy League schools, but where donors have an increasing amount of say over what happens in the schools and what faculty teach. I've experienced that up close, very, very close. And so we lose, but that wasn't always the case. There have always been donors. There's always been government support, or at least, for the past 100 years. And so something has happened to give undue weight and influence to those sources of money. And maybe it's just overvaluation of the money at the expense of mission. Or maybe it's just the overwhelming significance of sort of celebrities and personalities and networking that is part of institutional life today. It's a big problem to sort of crack open, but again, I would just say that it's these sort of late modern, to use a very blanket term, influences that have overwhelmed the original mission and idea.
Yeah, it is, and I think it's fascinating because, evangelicals, I guess at times evangelicals have been relatively intellectual, and at times they've been very kind of anti-intellectual. And it's interesting in America because both sides of those have all started educational institutions, right? I mean, I can think of institutions that were kind of founded by anti-intellectual fundamentalists as kind of educational institutions, and sort of feels like a strange thing, but then dealing with the history of these places and where they're headed. And certainly for me, I think one of the challenges is to say it's hard to find people who actually believe that the theological aspect of the education in Christian education is important, right? It's sort of, I think there's a lot of places where parents want their kids to go there so that they'll stay Republican, but they don't want them to really learn much about theology. They want them to learn business or something lucrative. Have you experienced much of that? What do you kind of make of that?
Yeah, I guess I was once a naive believer in in intentions and purposes, but I do, I do agree more with your assessment now, that a lot of the purpose and intention, whether it's on the part of the students or the administrators or the parents, is really about that social imaginary that says success is achieved a certain way, and success is achieved a certain, for within evangelicalism, success is first of all important, right? Material, financial success, and the way that you get that is by, majoring in a certain thing and voting a certain way and being associated with a certain party, and then also networking with people who are like-minded. And just to be completely candid, to throw out one example, I'm constantly in conversations with people who ask about sending their child, or why enrollment is rising so dramatically at an institution whose previous administration made headlines for the raunchiest kinds of lifestyle behaviors that are, like, most people would find unmentionable, and yet everyone, parents still send their children there. And I think it's because of what you just said, because there's this idea about what success looks like, what's required for it, and what's peripheral to it, and what doesn't really matter. And so some of these things have been turned upside down.
Are we allowed to say the name that you're talking about?
Yeah, sure. Do you know? I mean,
I don't actually.
Yeah. No, so Liberty University, where I taught for a number of years, and where I say this with, much sadness and grief, because I loved it there. I loved my ministry there. I loved my students and colleagues, but when it was uncovered that the president and his wife were involved in these sexual dalliances and even abuses and financial self-dealing, and all kinds of corruption, there were two options. There was the option of cleaning house, or kind of like pretending nothing ever happened, and that's where it all ended up after, it was almost as though nothing ever happened.
Oh, I see. So you see that as one of the signs that evangelicalism has taken a shift towards the worship of institutions, or perhaps not worship is too strong, but putting its trust in these institutions, being afraid that if they should fall, that it would damage us in some way, and so we need to protect it, even from the truth.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's a prominent example of, because that's still maybe the largest private Christian university in the U.S.
I think there are a couple that sort of argue. Oh, in the U.S. maybe that argue over that because it depends on the online. But
it has the largest faculty of any theological institution in the U.S. I think.
Yes, and number of graduates probably, and
so they're huge, and I think it's because they're seen to be ideologically aligned in the right ways, then people are sort of stunningly willing to look past all of the reality on the ground, which is,
and there's a pragmatism at play there as well, because I can't even count the number of conversations that I've had with people who said, well, I know there are problems here, but this is going to be the easiest way for me to get this credential or this degree and whatever. And so it's pragmatic.
Yeah, that's right. Which is, historically prominent in evangelicalism.
Sure. Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So I think it is interesting to see these, how these kinds of shifts then are impacting kind of institutions, and and vice, then how that turns around and shapes evangelicalism. I mean,
and it has, and just let me put this. I mean, and it has. We see the evangelicals, right? I mean, because they're individuals who are not buying into this and don't want to support it and don't know what to do with it and reject it or whatever. And so this is the direct fruit of individuals who just see no other option but to get out. Yeah, which I think is, for me, I think one of the things I was hoping we could do in these conversations, and I think it's been really helpful, is for all of the people remaining evangelical who are just critical of these silly evangelicals, seeing kind of what are they seeing, what are they not being able to kind of move forward with, and realizing that they don't, most of them don't have a lot of options either, right? Depending on where they live, what kind of churches there are, whatever, and so what are the alternatives that they have? But it's really helpful to sort of see these shifts, and to see one of the other things that you, I think, highlight really well is thinking about kind of educational institutions and how they might shape evangelicalism. One of the other things about evangelicalism is that it's typically been shaped much more by popular media than by, say, educational institutions, which is also, I thought it's really helpful that you kind of talk about what are the popular books and things like that have shaped. What are a couple of those for you that you think are significant? The books.
Yeah.
I mean, so I came of age when Hal Lindsey's late great Planet Earth. Well, I was a little kid, and that was in our household, and I grew up, with like my mother, never even knew or never registered that the rapture is like an interpretation, literal, right? I mean, it's just that's the gospel, but that was of an age. And then, as a, PhD student studying English literature, in the late 80s and 90s, and somebody came to me with this, I don't mean to be insulting, but it just I didn't know that there was something called Christian fiction. I just didn't read, so Frank Peretti, and someone's like, oh, you like literature, you'll like this book. And I opened it up and I was like, I read 3 pages. I'm like, no. I didn't know, it's not just because it's evangelical, it's also, it's like popular level fiction.
Yeah.
And so, but again, Christians don't even know that or evangelicals don't even know that there's a difference. And so, those are some of the early, and those titles coincide with the explosion of the publishing industry in general, not just evangelical publishing, but evangelical books ended up being a very lucrative arm of the larger publishing industry. And so it was a convergence of, the market and technology and population. And so much that happens in evangelicalism has been and continues to be driven by market influences. And that's, that's something we need to grapple with. I mean, it's most people just aren't even aware of how much their social imaginaries are being shaped by the categories and the aisles and the labels at, the local Christian store.
Yeah, I mean, it's something, for those of us who have gone on, done, academic work in theology, that is so striking. I think just realizing, I remember realizing oh, wow, all the things I've ever been told were just kind of made up by some random person somewhere who happened to sell a lot of books.
Right.
Yeah, which is, I think it's, and again, something you see for a lot of evangelicals kind of expressing this sense of, I think it's why they often have a sense of all this stuff about religion is just made up, right? If they've kind of grown up in that place and then start asking questions, it's not much of a jump to say oh, maybe, this anything to do with faith is just bogus because it's just, popular, whatever. It's something I see expressed a lot by people who are sort of in those kinds of spaces.
Yeah, I think I think the maybe the biggest common denominator I've seen is among those who are just shocked to find out that there are different views, right? If we could grow up and kind of be taught things and say, well, and just understand, well, this is our view, this is what we believe, but there are other views. I think that sort of groundwork alone would prevent so much collateral damage, because it would just not make people shocked to learn that there are other views.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and you can see why, I think, for example, like Dan McClellan, really big on TikTok, and he's just kind of doing the historical critical thing. And I think a lot of evangelicals are flocking to him because he's offering them, like, the promise of historical criticism is always like, I can prove scientifically what the Bible does and doesn't say. And so I think there's so many of them are grabbing still kind of in that, they were told growing up, this is what the Bible says for sure, and it doesn't say anything else. And then they were like, wait a second, it can mean anything. And sometimes that's the direction they go, to be like, oh, okay, now I can prove this is what the Bible says. And it happens to be the opposite of everything evangelicals think that it says. But still struggling to be like in a space where you're like, different people have different views, and it's really complex how they get to those, and different interpretations. It's one of the, again, maybe one of those common denominators that a lot of evangelicals are still very evangelical in that sense. Yeah. So what is your experience as a sort of teacher and author and all these things of the exvangelical movement? You have a lot of, young people are going through that, or friends, that kind of thing. What do you think's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I've watched this happen for years before I even had words like exvangelical or deconstruction or deconversion, and of course all those terms express slightly different things, but they're related. And again, I was teaching. I mean, I became a Christian as a little girl. I don't know the time, date, or hour because I was so young. But I said a few prayers in my life afterwards just to make sure. But I didn't grow up in evangelical subculture. Part of that was geographical, but part of it is also just age, because again, some of this sort of marketing that so defines evangelicalism today didn't really exist. It was just coming to be. So when I landed as a young professor in the world's largest evangelical university and was teaching primarily students who did grow up in that evangelical subculture, and I was also teaching primarily, not exclusively, but eventually, more and more just English majors who tend to be, critical thinkers or skeptics or whatever, they just aren't buying everything that's being sold. So that I have a sort of slanted experience in that regard, because I did watch so many of my students, questioning, often in healthy ways, but often in cynical ways, and watched a lot of them walk away from the faith. So again, this was often before we had the terms for it. But that's actually, this to kind of bring the conversation full circle, that those are the seeds for this book for the evangelical imagination, is kind of watching these students go, wait a minute, I was taught that if to just give a very blunt but too common example, I was taught that if I was raped, I'm not sexually pure, and where did that idea come from? Because it certainly doesn't come from the Bible. It's certainly not a Christian idea, but it does come from Victorian culture, evangelical culture. And so watching students grapple with, that kind of question and more nuanced, subtler questions than that, made me, think more about these things, but also I think maybe be ready for this movement that we're seeing even more frequently of evangelicalism and deconversion and deconstruction.
Yeah. And do you, in terms of one of the things that's interesting about evangelicalism is that it sometimes just names people